The colonel does not stop walking when the sound reaches him. He has heard artillery before. British 25-pounders in the western desert, French 75s in the hedgerows of France, Soviet guns along a front so wide it blurred into the weather.
He knows what artillery sounds like and what it means for the men on the receiving end. He keeps walking because what he is hearing now does not immediately register as something that requires stopping.
Then the second volley lands, and the pattern is wrong. Not wrong in volume. The individual reports are familiar enough. Wrong in geometry, wrong in timing, wrong in the interval between the rounds, and the way the adjustments arrive before any spotter could have called them in through the normal sequence of observation, calculation, and transmission.
He stops. He looks at his aide. His aide looks back with the expression of a man who is processing the same information and reaching the same conclusion.
This is not what the briefing said the Americans were capable of. This is not what any briefing said any force in this theater was capable of. The colonel's name is not recorded in the after-action report filed that evening, but the assessment filed by his commanding officer the following day is.
The commanding officer's name was Erwin Rommel, and what he wrote about American artillery at Guettar in March 1943 has been sitting in the German military archives for 80 years.
Nothing prepared us for this. 7 words. Filed under operational assessment. The highest form of military testimony available. A professional judgment made against the speaker's interest by someone who had every reason to dismiss what he was seeing, and instead reported it accurately, because accurate reporting was the only thing that kept his men alive.
This is not the story you were taught. The story you were taught, if you were taught a story at all, ends at Kasserine Pass. It ends in February 1943, with American units broken and retreating, with German armor moving through gaps in the Allied line that should not have existed, and with Rommel writing in his diary about the inexperience and confusion of the American soldier. That story is real. Kasserine happened. The retreat happened.
The confusion, the casualties, and the humiliation of watching a force you outranked in almost every metric run from a German armored thrust, that happened too. What did not happen is what came next. What came next was Guettar.
And what came next after Guettar was the professional assessment of a German commander who had spent 2 years in North Africa and had never written those words about anyone. But before Guettar, there was the dismissal. And the dismissal did not come from one source or one direction. It came from everywhere simultaneously, from sources with entirely different interests and entirely different frameworks, arriving at the same conclusion through entirely different routes. When independent observers with nothing in common except their assessment converge on the same judgment, the judgment carries a specific kind of weight. And when that convergent judgment is subsequently overturned by the evidence, the reversal carries the same weight, multiplied by every source it contradicts at once. The German assessment of American military capability in North Africa was not prejudice. It was a professional evaluation based on observed performance, and by February 1943, the observed performance had been consistently underwhelming. The I Corps, the American ground combat force in Tunisia, had arrived in theater in November 1942 with equipment that was technically adequate and experience that was practically non-existent. The soldiers had trained in the United States, had rehearsed combined arms operations on ranges in Louisiana and the Mojave Desert, and had studied the German operational methods in classrooms at Fort Benning and Fort Sill. None of that preparation had exposed them to what combat in Tunisia actually required.
The German intelligence assessment filed in January 1943 noted specifically, the American infantry shows adequate tactical awareness at the squad and platoon level, but lacks the integration required for effective combined arms operations at battalion scale and above.
The artillery is competent in isolation, but has not demonstrated the capacity for real-time adjustment and coordination that defines fire support effectiveness. The assessment concluded that American ground forces, while potentially dangerous once seasoned, represented a secondary threat relative to British forces in the theater.
The word used in the German original was zweitrangig, second-rate. The British assessment was different in its source and framework, but arrived at almost exactly the same place.
British commanders in North Africa had been fighting Germans since 1940. They had developed, through brutal education, a specific understanding of what it took to survive against German armored and combined arms operations, and that understanding had become the standard by which they measured all other forces.
The American I Corps, viewed through that standard, did not measure up.
Not because American soldiers were cowards or American officers were incompetent, but because the specific knowledge required, the knowledge that could only be acquired through repeated contact with German tactical methods under operational pressure, had to be earned, and the Americans had not yet paid for it.
A British liaison officer's report filed in late January 1943 noted, with the careful language of professional diplomacy, "Our American colleagues have shown considerable spirit in their early engagements, but have not yet developed the tactical integration and fire discipline that sustained operations against a first-class enemy require." The report recommended that American units not be employed in independent operations until further seasoning had occurred. The recommendation was filed and acknowledged. It was not acted upon because the operational situation in Tunisia did not permit the luxury of waiting for anyone to finish seasoning.
And then there was the American assessment of the American Army. This is the source that is most difficult to document and most important to understand because it was not filed in any report. It existed in the conversations between enlisted men, in the dark humor of units that had seen Kasserine and survived, in the specific register of institutional doubt that forms in any organization that has been tested and found wanting. The soldiers of the Second Corps knew what Kasserine had been. They had been there. They had retreated through gaps that should not have existed, had watched equipment abandoned because the order to withdraw had come faster than the ability to execute it cleanly, had experienced the specific humiliation of being pushed back by a force that was in almost every quantitative measure smaller than the force doing the retreating.
The institutional memory of Kasserine shaped everything that came after it. The doubt it produced was not irrational. It was evidence-based. And evidence-based doubt, when shared across an entire organization, becomes the operational environment within which every subsequent action takes place. 3 independent sources, 3 different interests, 3 different frameworks of evaluation.
1 convergent judgment. The American Army in North Africa was not yet ready. The symbol they carried into that judgment was the red 1 patch.
The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red 1, was the American unit most engaged in the Tunisian campaign in early 1943, and the patch on their shoulders had accumulated by February a specific set of associations that its wearers were not unaware of.
The British used the patch as shorthand for the American inexperience problem. When they said the Big Red 1, the tone implied an organization still learning what the patch was supposed to mean.
The German intelligence files referred to the 1st Infantry Division by designation and noted its performance at Kasserine, among other engagements, filing the same assessment they had filed about American forces generally.
And within the division itself, the patch was worn with the particular self-consciousness of soldiers who knew they were being watched, judged, and found wanting. A first sergeant in the 18th Infantry Regiment was documented in a unit diary as saying, sometime in February 1943, "They look at this patch and they think they know what it means. They're going to find out they're wrong." The diary entry was made by a chaplain. The first sergeant's name was not recorded, but the sentiment was recorded, which means it was considered worth recording.
Someone thought it was significant that a first sergeant had said those words in that tone in that moment. Someone was right.
The failure at Kasserine Pass on February 14th through 22nd, 1943, was not a simple military defeat. It was a diagnostic event, a test that produced data about specific failures in specific areas that could be identified and corrected if the organization had the capacity to learn from evidence under pressure. The data was not ambiguous. The Second Corps had failed at the coordination level. Individual units, battalions, companies, in some cases platoons, had performed adequately or better in isolation. The problem was the integration. When the German 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions drove through Kasserine Pass, they were not defeating better soldiers in individual combat.
They were exploiting the gaps that appeared when units did not know what adjacent units were doing, when artillery support arrived late or at the wrong coordinates, when the communication between the elements of the combined arms team broke down under the speed and pressure of a German armored thrust, executed by men who had been doing exactly this for 3 years against the best forces Britain could field.
General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2nd Corps at Kasserine, was relieved of command on March 6, 1943. His replacement was Major General George S. Patton, who arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters and immediately began doing things that had not been done before.
He enforced uniform regulations with a ferocity that seemed, to the soldiers on the receiving end, to be entirely disconnected from the actual problem. He imposed physical fitness standards that seemed punitive rather than preparatory. He reorganized the headquarters staff in ways that disrupted established workflows and produced considerable friction and complaint.
What he was actually doing, what the subsequent performance of 2nd Corps demonstrated he had been doing, was rebuilding the command culture from its foundations. He was replacing the culture of improvisation and exception that had accumulated under Fredendall with a culture of standard, expectation, and consequence.
The change was not comfortable. It was not meant to be, but it was identifiable as a change by anyone who was watching closely. And there were German intelligence officers watching closely.
The after-action reports from German units in Tunisia in the first weeks of March 1943 contain a recurring observation. American unit coordination appears to be improving. The observation is noted without alarm, filed as a data point in the ongoing assessment of I Corps capability.
The German operational planning for the spring campaign in Tunisia did not significantly revise its assessment of American ground forces. The division-level planning for the German counteroffensive through El Guettar on March 23, 1943, treated the 2nd Corps as a manageable threat, something to be pushed aside on the way to more significant objectives.
The 10th Panzer Division was tasked with the El Guettar operation. The 10th Panzer was one of the best armored divisions in the German army. It had fought at Kasserine. It had a specific evidence-based assessment of what American forces in this terrain would do when a German armored column drove at them.
The assessment was not unreasonable given the data available. The data available was about to change. The morning of March 23, 1943 was cold in the way that North African mornings in March are cold. Not the brutal cold of the European Eastern Front, but the specific sharp cold of desert altitude at dawn. The kind of cold that makes the fingers slow, the breath visible, and the ground hard under boots designed for temperate climates. The soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division had been in position since the night before. They had dug in, which the Americans were getting better at because General Patton had made digging in a standard rather than an option. The artillery batteries, the 5th Field Artillery Battalion and the 32nd Field Artillery Brigade, among others, had pre-registered their targets in the valley below. Pre-registration meant the guns had already fired on specific coordinates and recorded the adjustments needed to put rounds exactly where they were aimed. When targets appeared at those coordinates, the time between observation and accurate fire would be measured in seconds, not minutes. The Germans, based on their assessment of American fire discipline, were not planning for seconds. At approximately 06, the 10th Panzer Division began its advance toward El Guettar.
The column was organized for penetration. Armor forward, infantry following. The configuration that had driven through Kasserine, through the gaps in the British line at Gazala, and through the Soviet positions at a dozen engagements across 2 years of combat. The configuration assumed a specific response from the defending force. Incoming fire, initial disruption, reorganization, and a gap forming somewhere in the defensive line through which the armor could accelerate. The 10th Panzer had executed this sequence so many times against so many different defenders that it had become a kind of professional reflex.
The sequence began. The incoming fire arrived. And then something happened that was not in the sequence. The adjustments came too fast. This is the specific technical detail that is documented in the German after-action reports, and that explains, more precisely than any general description could, what the 10th Panzer encountered at El Guettar.
When artillery fires on a moving target, the standard sequence requires observing where the rounds landed, transmitting that observation to the fire direction center, calculating the correction,
transmitting the correction to the battery and applying the correction before the next round is fired.
Under ideal conditions, this sequence takes several minutes. Under combat conditions, with communications under pressure and spotters in concealed positions reporting through degraded radio links, it can take considerably longer.
The Americans at El Guettar have reduced this sequence to something the German officers had not encountered before. The forward observers were positioned, trained, and communicating in a way that allowed corrections to be applied between volleys rather than between fire missions.
The guns were shifting from one pre-registered target to the next with an accuracy and speed that meant the German armor was receiving accurate fire almost from the moment of first contact.
The 10th Panzer's initial advance was stopped within 40 minutes. Not disrupted, not slowed and then reorganized. Stopped. 53 German tanks were destroyed or disabled in the El Guettar engagement over the course of March 23rd.
The exact figure is 53, documented in both American after-action reports and German maintenance records. The 10th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the German army, lost more than a quarter of its operational tank strength in a single day against a force it had assessed as manageable.
The survivors withdrew. The after-action reports filed by German commanders that evening contain language that is, by the standards of German military reporting, unusual.
The phrase used repeatedly is not that the Americans fought well or showed improvement, but that the fire support was unlike anything previously encountered in this theater.
The artillery coordination was professionally executed at a level inconsistent with the prior assessment of this force. In military bureaucratic language, that is an extraordinary statement. It means we were wrong and we need to revise everything we thought we knew.
Rommel was not present at El Guettar. He had been recalled to Germany for medical treatment on March 9th, but the reports reached him.
What he wrote in his diary in late March 1943, after reviewing the Tunisia after-action assessments, is the sentence sitting in the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg since the war ended.
Nothing prepared us for this. The diary context makes clear he is referring specifically to the artillery coordination, the speed and accuracy that stopped the 10th Panzer, not a general assessment of American capability, a precise professional observation about a specific capability his intelligence had failed to anticipate. A man who spent 2 years driving tanks through gaps in British defensive lines is saying, in a private record kept for his own use, that the Americans had done something his experience had not prepared him to counter. That is the adversarial recognition that matters, not generosity, not retrospective revision, a professional enemy, unable to report otherwise. But what El Guettar meant strategically requires the wider frame that the tactical account alone cannot provide. By March 23, 1943, the North African campaign was 3 years old. Montgomery's 8th Army was compressing from the east. The 2nd Corps was operating in the center and west. German High Command had been treating the American sector as the soft flank, the place to apply pressure while holding against the British. El Guettar ended that calculation. Not because the 10th Panzer was destroyed, it was not. The German forces in Tunisia would not surrender until May 13th. But after March 23rd, the 10th Panzer did not mount another large-scale armored offensive against American positions. The German tactical planning in the American sector consistently avoided the direct armored assault that had been standard before that date. In a compressed theater with a shrinking perimeter and no reinforcements, caution is the beginning of the end. El Guettar made the Germans cautious. That was enough. The soldiers who operated those artillery batteries on March 23rd were men from Oklahoma, Georgia, and Pennsylvania who had arrived in North Africa 6 months earlier, with training their allies considered inadequate and their enemies considered negligible.
The gunnery specialists of the 5th Field Artillery Battalion had trained at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, on doctrine built from the lessons of the First World War. Reduce the time between observation and adjustment through better equipment, better procedures, and better positioning. The doctrine was correct.
The time required to implement it was the 6 months between arrival in theater and El Guettar, 6 months that included Kasserine, which produced the specific knowledge that made El Guettar possible. There is a specific name attached to the forward observer whose transmission on March 23rd
contributed most directly to the early, accurate fire against the 10th Panzer's lead elements. Second Lieutenant John T. Corley, assigned to the 18th Infantry Regiment's fire support team. 23 years old, from New York City, he was lying in a concealed position on a ridge above the Guettar Valley with a radio handset and field binoculars, watching German tanks approach, transmitting corrections with a speed the commanders below had not planned for.
He survived the war. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. He retired as a brigadier general in 1969. His after-action report is filed in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, under Record Group 407.
It contains specific grid coordinates, specific times, and specific corrections. It is the documentary record of exactly what Rommel wrote about in his diary. The two documents have never been read together. The try-fail-adapt architecture of what happened between Kasserine and Guettar is visible in the specific changes Patton implemented between March 6th and March 23rd. Kasserine had identified 3 failures. Forward observers were positioned too far back, seeing targets late and transmitting corrections through longer radio chains. Patton's training pushed them forward to the edge of the battle area. The Fire Directions Center was calculating corrections manually instead of using pre-computed tables for the most likely target zones. Pre-registration solved this. Communication protocols between infantry and artillery were not standardized across the Corps. Different battalions using different call for fire procedures created gaps when fire had to cross unit boundaries. Patton's headquarters standardized them across I Corps in 17 days. 17 days between assumption of command and the morning of March 23rd. That is the specific fact, not that they corrected their failures eventually. They corrected specific identified failures in 17 days while maintaining a defensive line against a force that had beaten them 3 weeks earlier. The terrain at Guettar is not open desert. It is a narrow valley flanked by ridges, compressed and intimate, nothing like the flat expanses where the Germans had previously assessed American capability and found it lacking. In open desert, observation distances limit how fast a forward observer can call corrections. At Guettar, the ridgelines put German armor within naked eye range of American observers. A trained man with field binoculars could see exactly where a round landed and transmit the correction in seconds rather than minutes. The Germans had studied American artillery in open terrain and drawn their conclusions. Guettar was not open terrain. The compression of the valley, the specific closeness that brought the 10th Panzer within Corley's direct observation, revealed a dimension of the American artillery team's capability that no prior engagement had tested. The prior phase was not wrong. It was incomplete. Guettar completed it. The German prisoners taken at Guettar, 1,100 men, documented in the Second Corps after-action report, were processed near Gafsa. Among them was a German artillery hauptmann, a captain, whose observation post had been overrun in the afternoon counterattack. Asked through an interpreter what had surprised him most, his answer was transcribed verbatim. The corrections. We have never seen corrections that fast. In the German army, the time required for that kind of adjustment is not measured in seconds. Then, he added, they shoot like they have done it their whole lives. A professional artilleryman with 3 years of war behind him, he was not being generous. He was reporting what he had observed from a position where accuracy mattered. His assessment and Rommel's diary entry are independent testimonies from different levels of the German command structure, reached by different routes, saying the same thing without coordination. This is what documented convergence looks like. The reversal of the dismissal cascade that Guettar produced was not generic. Each source that had filed a dismissive assessment before March 23rd filed a revised assessment after it. The German intelligence evaluation of I Corps, filed in early April 1943, significantly upgraded the rating of American artillery from its January 1943 baseline. The phrase zweitrangig does not appear in the April evaluation. The British liaison reports filed in the days after Guettar note, with the same careful professional language that had been used to doubt, that American artillery coordination at Guettar demonstrated a level of competence that had not been observed in prior engagements. The report recommending that American units not be employed in independent operations
was superseded by a new assessment that described I Corps as fully capable of independent operations in the appropriate terrain. And within the 1st Infantry Division itself, the Red 1 patch that had been worn with the self-consciousness of institutional doubt was by the end of March 1943 worn differently. The first sergeant in the 18th Infantry Regiment, whose words had been recorded in the chaplain's diary, did not need to say anything else.
The Germans had said it for him. The moral dimension of what happened after El Guettar is documented in the prisoner processing reports and in the unit diaries of the military police units that handled the German prisoners.
The 1,100 Germans captured at El Guettar were fed, given medical attention for their wounded, and transported under guard to the prisoner collection point without incident. The military police after-action report notes, as a matter of routine administrative documentation, that no prisoner complaints about treatment were filed.
This is a bureaucratic entry in a military report.
It is also a specific fact about what the 1st Infantry Division chose to do at the moment of its first significant victory, at the moment when it held for the first time in its North African experience the organizational initiative, when the Germans were the ones retreating and the Americans were the ones deciding what happened next. They chose to process the prisoners correctly. They chose to provide medical care.
They chose, in the specific language of the after-action report, to maintain professional conduct throughout the prisoner processing operation. These words, professional conduct, appear in a logistics report filed by a military police captain about prisoner handling. They are the specific form of testimony about character that exists in the historical record for El Guettar. The soldiers who fired those guns and observed those targets and corrected that fire on March 23, 1943, were not yet 25 years old, most of them. They would fight through Sicily, through Italy, through France, through Germany.
The 1st Infantry Division would be among the first American units to land at Normandy on June 6, 1944, at a section of beach designated Omaha, in the most difficult landing of the entire D-Day operation. They would take casualties on that beach that were measured in thousands. They would advance off that beach anyway. The soldiers who did that had learned something at El Guettar, something about what they were capable of and what the dismissal had failed to measure, that they carried with them through everything that came after.
The Red 1 patch that had been worn with institutional doubt in February 1943 was worn by June 1944 with something that is harder to name, but is visible in the photographs taken on Omaha Beach. Men who know exactly what they are capable of, because they have already demonstrated it to the only audience whose assessment carries professional weight.
The account of El Guettar has been in the archives since 1943. The German after-action reports are in Freiburg. The American after-action reports are in College Park. The prisoner interrogation transcripts are in the National Archives. Rommel's diary, including the entry about the artillery, was published in English translation in 1953. John Corley's after-action report has been available to researchers for decades. The British liaison reports are in the Public Record Office at Kew. The account exists completely in multiple independent source categories, corroborated across languages and from both sides of the engagement.
It has never been assembled as a single complete account and delivered to the people it concerns most, the descendants of the soldiers who earned the assessment that Rommel filed under operational pressure and never revised. The documentary record is complete.
The historical significance is documented. The adversarial validation is on the page, in 7 words, written by the most respected German commander of the Second World War in a private diary he kept for his own use, not for publication, not for the historical record, not for any audience at all except himself. Nothing prepared us for this. The account exists. It was never delivered. If this account reached you today, if you heard for the first time what happened at El Guettar in March 1943, what Rommel wrote in his diary about it, what the German Hauptmann said about the corrections, what Corley's after-action report contains at grid coordinates that haven't been read in decades, then the transmission that should have happened 80 years ago just completed.
Share this video not because the channel needs the numbers, but because every person who watches it receives a transmission that has been waiting in an archive since 1945.
Subscribe not to support this channel, but because this is where the accounts that were completed but never delivered get delivered. The soldiers who earn that diary entry deserve to have it read by the people who descend from the country they defended. Rommel filed his assessment in 1943. It took until now to reach you. The delivery is overdue.